Welcome back to another episode of Christian Natural Health. Today, I'm very pleased to have Bronwyn Schweigerdt with us. Bronwyn may be the most evocative psychotherapist you've ever heard. Instead of fixing people's messes, her goal is to elicit feelings you're most ashamed to have, such as hatred and betrayal. She knows that even though feelings are invisible, they don't evaporate, but store away in our bodies when they're disowned. Bronwyn has a master's degree in counseling and another in nutrition. She's a public speaker, author, and licensed psychotherapist. Welcome, Bronwyn. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, Lauren.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what's your backstory? How did you become an anger expert? That's kind of unique.
Yes. So my backstory is more a backstory of how I became a therapist as well, actually. So my first, like you read, my first degree or my first master's and career was in nutrition, and I was not planning to go back to school and get a second master's or a second career.
Yeah.
But I fell myself into a very, very severe depressive episode.
Mm.
Um, and I went to multiple therapists. And, each time, and this was back when it was in person only, um, and each time I would be sitting there thinking to myself during the session, I'm hardly functioning right now, but I'm still pretty sure I would make a better therapist to me than this person. And I went through about four different therapists during that season. That's not just my lifelong experience, but
Right.
yeah, and none of them were a good therapist for me. So I decided part of my healing journey for that depressive episode, and I had another after that was even worse in a way. But for that episode, going back to school and getting my master's in counseling psychology and then getting my hours, I really wanted to be that therapist that I needed for
Hmm.
myself and be that for others.
Yeah.
And so, in retrospect, looking back at that depressive episode and the subsequent one that was not worse in maybe acuteness, but worse in like it lasted much longer, like years.
Sure.
Um, I see that the common denominator was suppressed anger. And I started kind of putting together the pieces like, and not just anger, betrayal. So
Hmm.
betrayal is a specific type of anger. Betrayal is when someone we have expectations of, like a parent or a partner or, someone really close to us is not meeting those expectations.
Hmm.
It's not just any old type of anger. Anger can be at someone who cuts you off in the freeway,
Sure.
but that's not a betrayal. And
Right.
betrayal is so much deeper,
Uh,
and so I realized, each time it was this betrayal. My first was when my husband, we had just moved and relocated about an hour and a half away, but it was like the dark side of the moon for me because I knew no one and I didn't have a job. I mean, I lost my job when we moved, and my daughter, I just have one child. She was just starting school. So I was like alone all day in this new city I didn't want to be in. My
mm,
husband's off at work, my daughter's at school, and I'm just like so lonely.
yeah.
And when I tried to share that with my husband, like when we first got there, I just have this memory of the look on his face was just like not empathetic at all. And we've talked about it now. It's been like 15 years now, but in hindsight, it wasn't like he was just withholding empathy to be cruel, but he ascribed to that old worldview of like, if if I just withhold empathy, if somehow he thought if I gave my wife empathy, it would enable it and it would get worse, and
Oh,
her
interesting.
neediness and her pain would somehow worsen, and then she'd be just a mess. And so if I withhold it, it'll help her just buckle through and just like buck up and get over it, right? But
Interesting.
for me, that look on his face and that withholding of empathy was very much reminiscent of what my mom did to me my whole life, which I think was more for the cruel objective of just withholding empathy from me. And so it triggered this
All that reaction.
betrayal. And yeah, and so that was actually, so the loneliness was bad enough, but then on top of that betrayal from my current attachment figure who's
Right.
doing something my mom did my whole life, was just too much, and it just sent me down. So that was that. And if at that time I had really felt valid to feel that betrayal and to feel that anger, and said to my husband, you know what, Steve, you're doing what my mom did. And I know your intention isn't to be cruel, but I need you to be my attachment figure right now. I need you to
Right.
show me empathy. And it's not going to make things worse. It's actually going to make things better. And if he had, and I think he would have then,
If you'd
done
said,
that.
yeah,
And that would have saved me from that major, major depressive episode.
sure. Yeah.
And so it's really about being aware and knowing that our feelings matter, that they're
Right.
valid, that we're entitled to feel their feelings. It doesn't mean, we're going to explode and become a raging, angry person. It
Mhm.
just means we're going to say to ourselves, you know what,
Mhm.
Bronwyn, you're entitled to feel this. This isn't bad to feel. And
Mhm.
you can channel it out of your body by assertiveness and saying, hey, this is what I need from you right now. I need you to not betray me. And so that is really my expertise, is because so many of us just have such a unhealthy relationship with our anger. We
Mhm.
dissociate from it
Mhm.
in many respects, and one is a common one is just going to our heads. I mean, our brains help us dissociate they from our feelings, because
Mhm.
this is all logic. And so we say, oh, well, he didn't mean to do that, and so we can
Right.
just pretend it didn't
Nice.
happen and
Yep.
pretend we don't feel betrayed. And it doesn't help. It
Right.
doesn't help because the feelings are very much alive
Sure.
and well. And I like to say, even though our feelings are invisible, I mean, I believe they're more real than the couch I'm sitting on right now. They're more real than this laptop. They are real, and they don't just dissipate into the ether if we ignore them. They very much haunt us, and they stay embodied in us, and they cause us to get sick one way or another. So, my big ones were through depression, but most of my clients come to me with profound anxiety. And anxiety is the same thing. It's anger suppressed in our bodies or disassociated from, that's still in our bodies.
Interesting. So when you were seeing those four therapists who didn't help you and they
Mhm.
weren't trying to address that, was there like a common thread of approaches that they use that are maybe fairly typical for most therapeutic approaches that aren't, in your opinion, very useful and that maybe you learned when you were in school?
Yeah. Yeah. So they kind of span the whole range, but some therapists will just, the first one I went to, will just sit and listen and go, uh huh, uh
Mm.
huh. Oh, how
Right.
does that make you feel? Uh huh. And like, and so you're just like, no, your job is to be a mirror. Your
Right.
job is to help me see myself, a true
Mhm.
reflection.
Sure.
And so that's not just, I mean, listening is really vital,
Mhm.
but without that reflection of like, well, Bronwyn, have you noticed these patterns in what you're
Right,
saying?
right,
Have you
right.
noticed that this is an echo of an earlier time in your life? Without that reflection back,
You're not getting anything.
that's not helpful. And then I think the other end of this spectrum that's really common is
Mhm.
actually
Mhm.
kind of in um, it's kind of compensating for the only listening therapy, which is more CBT or DBT therapy, where it's not much listening at all, and it's more like just symptom management, but
Mhm.
it is a lot of feedback. And so it's kind of like trying to compensate for the only listening, but it's going way too far, where that, and I had that too, where the
Mhm.
therapist is listening to you for maybe 10 minutes and they're like, well, what about going for a walk every day?
Oh,
When you're
sure.
you're saying you're depressed, like walks really help, and you're like, I could Google that, or that's just like common sense. I don't need a
Sure.
therapist, and you're not being a mirror either, because you're not really understanding what you're doing there with the DBT and CBT therapy, and what I call alphabet soup, because there's ACT, there's all these acronyms. But what all they're doing is really managing symptoms, and it's very superficial. So the
Mhm.
symptoms are
Mhm.
depression. The symptoms are I can't get out of bed. The symptoms are I'm overeating. But let's get to the root. And the root are
Mhm.
the feelings, which are usually anger, betrayal, a feeling of abandonment or rejection. And those things are all very much, different facets of the same thing.
Sure, absolutely. And so I have a feeling I know what you're going to say to this, but what's your perspective on medication in that situation?
Well, of course, that just manages the symptoms.
Right.
And so how sad is that you're just like that medication is just kind of helping you better wither the
Mm,
root problem that you're not actually addressing. And so that's what anger is, though. Anger isn't something to avoid or dissociate from, as
mhm,
a lot of us see it as, because we just only associate it with people who are explosive and violent or verbally violent. But
mhm,
anger is a light on the dashboard of our emotional car saying, you know what, something's wrong. You need to check under the hood and resolve it and bring it to resolution. And so our anger is that signal, that warning that's saying there's something, there's a root problem and we
mhm,
need to bring it to resolution. And so when we can develop a healthy relationship with our anger,
mhm,
saying, you know what, I can feel this right now. I can just feel it in my body. All I'm
mhm,
going to do is just allow myself to feel it in my body.
mhm.
And it's going to tell me what I need to do. It's going to give me information, vital wisdom for how
Yeah,
to move forward. And
right.
so that is usually some kind of assertiveness
Mhm,
and or boundary or accountability.
mhm, yeah. Is this something that you learned in school, or did you kind of deduce it on your own? Okay, not at all.
Not
So
at all.
it's not their perspective. They don't seem to believe, or is the traditional view that the feelings aren't coming from some place real? Like, is it just that they're a chemical imbalance, or what is the prevailing theory, you know?
Well, in school they don't give you one theory. They
Okay,
kind of expose you to all these different theories, and and there are theories called like emotionally focused.
right?
There's uh, internal family systems, which is more of a novel theory, which is working with, I don't use that per se, but working with the inner child, that is a theoretical
Mhm.
philosophy. And so they kind of expose you to all these different ones, but you are just like supposed to learn about them all and kind of pick and choose. And
What
most
feels right
therapists
to you?
call themselves eclectic, where they're using a little of this, but they're not. For me, the real theory that works is what we call attachment theory, because attachment theory um, believes that in our early childhood with our primary attachment figures,
Mhm,
our young selves learned things that need to be unlearned currently, and we learn those through what we call imprints. So if I, like I mentioned, I had a mother who didn't show me empathy or compassion, and so that's a trigger for me now in the present. So if I'm talking to you, Lauren, and you're like, yeah, yeah, and then you start looking away, and I'm still talking and you're looking away, like little Bronwyn is very triggered because that was a big imprint for her
sure.
on, feeling rejected. And that was something. And so when we get that awareness and we go, oh, that's little Bronwyn feeling rejected. And instead of me exploding, I
Mhm,
can say, hey, Lauren, is this a bad time? Like, it looks like you're distracted.
mhm.
And then maybe you're like, yeah, actually, my daughter's calling me and she just got in an accident. And I'm like, oh, okay, good to know.
Right,
Let's reschedule. So I can be productive with that feeling of
right.
rejection instead of just,
React.
I can master it instead of
Yeah,
it mastering me. Right.
right. Absolutely. Interesting. So, w- is there ever an easy way, or easy is, I'm sure none of this is ever easy, but is there a way to help to identify when the emotion that is stuffed is because of a true trigger in your past, as opposed to a thinking process that's warped? Do you know what I mean by that? Like, how can
Mm.
you distinguish? How do you approach that when it seems like somebody has a distorted view of the world, and maybe they're angry about something that either didn't happen, or a distortion of something that happened where they believe something else about it? How do you use this approach in a situation like that?
Well, can you give me an example? Are you thinking of something specific yourself right now?
I'm thinking of something along the lines of like catastrophic thinking, like beliefs about the world, as in like I'm always going to be a failure, or everybody's always going to reject me, or something along
Mm-hmm.
those lines. In your
Yeah.
experience, is there always something that was completely legitimate at the foundation of that, or can it ever just be that the focus? Because my understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy, for example,
Mm-hmm.
maybe I didn't know what it was, but I thought that essentially it was recognizing if there's a false thought pattern that is keeping you
Mhm.
stuck, helping you to shift out of that as opposed to trying to dig up the foundation. So I wanted
Yeah,
to know,
that's
is
what it
there,
is. Yeah.
okay, okay.
Well, I mean, that's a really good point you're bringing up. You're right. That's what cognitive behavioral therapy is.
Mhm.
And if only it were that simple as just like identifying this faulty belief and going, oh,
That's wrong.
that's actually not true.
Sure.
So if that worked, CBT would be awesome because you don't have to dig into the past and it would be so quick and efficient and all these things that it was designed
Right.
to be.
Yeah.
But the thing is, so that's why I say we dissociate into our brain. So that's up here in the prefrontal
Yeah.
cortex,
Right.
but where our attachment wounds are in the limbic brain, which is where our feelings are. So
Mhm.
even if we are able to intellectually
Mhm.
change our thought thinking system,
Mhm.
that hopelessness, that despair is still living and active and very much alive and active. And that is what we learned in our early childhood from those early imprints.
Mhm.
So, what I lead my clients on, and I spend a lot of my podcasts on this. I have a co host, she's actually my best friend,
Mhm.
Katie. She's not a therapist.
Yeah.
And, but she allows me to do some of the exercises that I do with my clients on her
Mhm.
in the podcast because my goal is that the listeners will be able to do this for themselves. So people who aren't ever going to be my clients can take this in.
Yeah.
But so I lead my clients in what's called I call it an integration exercise. And so the goal of therapy ultimately really should be helping people to integrate, and that is integrating with our own inner child that causes the integration of those different parts of our brain. So it's complete, it's whole, it's integral. That healing isn't just in our adult minds,
Mhm.
it's really where it started, that hopelessness, that despair that you were alluding to. And
Mhm.
if we don't do that, that hopeless and despair will continue to show up in maybe different thoughts or different
Mhm.
systems. It will still mess with us in
Right.
some way, even if we've intellectually, changed our thought patterns.
Sure. Yeah. So with your example of your mom when you were growing up,
Mhm.
like that level of wound, is there a process by which you kind of let go and forgive, or is it more about focusing on when you're triggered by that memory now and not letting that master you? Which one is the focus, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah. So, for me to go back to those imprints, the early imprints, it could just be one memory that's emblematic of a host of things.
Sure.
Um, and I lead my clients, and then, like I said, for my podcast listeners too,
Sure.
picking one of those memories that's emblematic of
Right.
feeling that level of rejection from the
Mhm.
mom. So I would lead, let's say I did this with Katie, I would say, okay, what's the look on little Katie's face when she's being, rejected by her mom? And then I lead adult Katie to enter that memory,
Mhm.
and then let little Katie know, you know what, little Katie, I know you feel rejected and unwanted and unloved, but I need you to hear the truth from me and what I know now,
Mhm.
which is you were rejected, but you were rejected because that was a mom problem, not a little Katie problem. 100% a mom problem. And little Katie, you are loved and seen and wanted by me. I'm
Mhm.
here now, and I'm going to be that person for you who sees you unconditionally, who always is that mirror back to you, who reflects your worth and your importance to me. And
Mhm.
you're precious to me, and you belong to me. And
Mhm.
you've got me now. You've won my approval.
Mhm.
And so I need you to know the truth about what I see when I look at you. And so it's just letting go of that original attachment figure,
Mhm.
healing with ourselves.
Right.
And then once we are able to do that, we've unlearned that
Mhm.
we are unwanted. So that trigger's gone.
Right.
Um, Not like 100%, but it's
Of course.
really subsided.
Sure.
Um, and when we think about that parent, when they hurt us,
Mhm.
we're really able to see them more objectively.
Mhm.
And so because we don't need them to be the parent, we're like kind of free, like, oh,
Mhm.
I am that person for me now. And
Right.
so I can see you more, in a way, I am really angry by what you did, but in another way, I see that you were so wounded internally too. And
Mhm.
I feel, pity for you because you were just a little child yourself, and so we have that level of objectivity.
Right. It's like you've delinked the limbic hijacking kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and what would you say is the relationship between the anger that gets unearthed from some of this and like the shame trigger? Are they related?
Yeah, so I think that's another great question. They shouldn't be related.
Hmm.
And I'm my next episode actually. I have my notes for. I'm actually going to talk a lot about this. So the word emotion means like
Hmm.
motion. It means things that evoke motion. So anger, sadness, these feelings are in our bodies, and they're giving us wisdom and insight for what we need. Our feelings tell us what we need. So when we feel sad, we need to cry, not by ourselves, but we need to cry with someone who can hear us and maybe hold us and validate us. And what's shareable is bearable. So we need to feel seen and felt by someone else. um, when we're angry, we need to be validated by someone else. We can do that for ourselves as well, which is optimal.
Hmm.
Um, but anyway, emotions are designed to move us, they're designed to give us wisdom into how to heal. But shame is not an emotion,
Mm.
shame is just a feeling.
Okay.
And we, a lot of times, I think we conflate it with other emotions. It's not meant to move us. It's not,
Like a
you
state.
know,
Yeah.
what's that?
Like a state of being almost.
It's a state of being, and unlike all the other feelings are there from birth. They're, God given. We were born into the world with feelings that are designed to give us wisdom. Shame
Hmm.
is actually a social construct. Shame is always learned,
Hmm. Okay.
always learned. And so it's not native. It's not a native feeling,
Hmm.
and it doesn't move us anywhere. It actually shuts us down.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it shuts us down so much that we dissociate from it.
Hmm.
I um i have had clients tell me, like, when they start dissociating because they're ashamed of themselves,
Hmm.
they start doing things. It's like they feel like they're not even in their bodies, and then later they're like, I can't believe I said those things, I can't believe I did. I mean, talk about Jekyll and Hyde. Shame, that's what it causes us, what we call in therapy, to split.
Interesting.
Shame makes us split. And
Okay.
a lot of people do split from their own anger because they were taught
That it's
by
bad
their primary attachment figure that it's shameful.
to be.
Don't feel angry. That is shameful. So we split
Mhm.
from our own anger
Yeah.
and we dissociate from it, and then it masters us instead of us mastering it by channeling it out in healthy ways.
Right.
It masters us. And so, but then those same people, when some of them, when they're confronted by it later, they don't even remember it, or they're in this kind of denial, because that's another kind of splitting or
Right.
dissociation,
Yeah.
where they're like, i didn't I didn't say that like that, you
Mhm.
know and
Mhm.
and that's all shame. It's only negative, it's only damaging.
Yeah. So part of the process sounds like getting people, if they have that idea that anger is bad,
Mhm.
rewriting that and recognizing that it's
Absolutely.
okay and it has a positive impact or positive purpose. What can you briefly state that? What is the positive purpose of anger?
The positive purpose of anger is to give us wisdom
Mhm.
to how to resolve a root problem.
Mm, okay.
And anger is always a secondary emotion, not a primary. So
Mm,
under the anger is some kind of hurt, again, usually from a feeling of rejection, abandonment, betrayal.
yeah. Interesting. So, one of the things that occasionally talk about is the fact that the idea that there's no such thing as an angry person. Is this why? Because anger is kind of like a higher level of something else that's underneath.
No, well, that is true, but I like to say that there's no such thing as an angry person, because that's like saying, well, I'm a breathing person and that
Oh,
person's not a breathing person. Like
oh,
all
I
all
see.
all humans have anger.
Yeah.
And so I don't like that stigma, oh, she's an angry person. I'm
Yeah.
not an angry person. It's like, are you breathing? Are you human? Then you have anger.
Sure.
And so it's just a matter of your relationship to your anger. You're
Right.
either likely suppressing it
Yeah.
or exploding. And
Mhm.
there's very few people who are just in the healthy, assertive middle where they're like, hey, Lauren, you said you'd show up at 10 and you came on the call at 10:20. What's up with that? That's my anger being channeled out in a
Mhm.
healthy way. That's assertiveness. And
Mhm.
it gets underreported. It's not as sensational as what we associate with real anger, right? But it is real anger.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So, when people are first digging up, or unearthing some of the things that have been suppressed long term, I imagine for many people there's a fear that, like, what if I bring this up and I can't control it? And that's part of the reason for suppressing it, I would imagine. What do you say to early or um, clients earlier on who
Mm.
have that concern or that fear? They don't want to go back into to potentially bring up old trauma.
Yeah, I there is a lot of fear, but I don't think it's so much of that as um, fear of abandonment.
How so?
So most of the people who come to therapy, I would say the majority are on the codependent spectrum.
Mm,
Those are
okay.
the ones who have the anxiety that seems to be
Okay.
more for codependence. And codependents are the ones who come to therapy because they say, Bronwyn, what else can I do to help fix my relationships, to help other people? How can I twist myself more into a pretzel than I already am to make everyone happy in my life?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, you can't.
Mm-hmm.
And those are some toxic people. And they're like, oh, no, no, no. I just need to twist myself more into a pretzel so that they won't be so angry at me.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk a lot about codependency. I have a whole podcast
Yeah.
on that. But what they all have in common is they learned very early in their childhood, probably around age 2 when they first started to differentiate from their parents at the terrible twos,
Mm-hmm.
and the parent didn't like that, wasn't okay with the child differentiating by saying no and mine and those things that 2-year-olds say. They learned maybe with just a look on the parent's face, or maybe words, but maybe more just like seeing seeing some silent treatment going on,
Mm-hmm.
that if they show their anger or differentiate or
Mm-hmm.
say no or have boundaries, that mom's going to abandon them, at least for a while,
Mm-hmm.
mentally, emotionally, maybe physically.
Mm-hmm.
And so they learn to associate anger with abandonment. And so deep
Mm-hmm.
down, their inner child is so afraid of their own anger because they're afraid of being all alone and rejected and abandoned, like they experience at those early imprints. Yeah.
Interesting. So you said that both depression and anxiety can be manifestations of suppressed anger.
Mhm.
What would make somebody kind of go in more one direction than another, anxiety versus depression, or do they typically just coexist in your experience? Do most people who are anxious also feel depressed and vice versa?
Yeah, I don't really understand. A lot of them will have both,
Okay.
maybe be more on the anxious side because it's so chronic.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't really see any rhyme or reason for
Mm-hmm.
why anxiety or depression. But I will say, um, I actually believe that all mental health problems are from dissociated anger. So I had one client, she's still with me. She's doing great now. But when she came to me, she was actually diagnosed with psychosis,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a very serious diagnosis. Like that's like where they put you in an institution. She had really severe hallucinations at times,
Mm-hmm.
and so but it was all suppressed anger,
Hmm.
and she's doing great now. Like she's
Oh,
the
wow.
healthiest person ever now. And as my background, like I said, was in nutrition, I
Yeah.
never would have believed this, honestly, like even 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But now I see how much it causes physical illness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, migraines, I believe, are absolutely suppressed anger. GI issues
Mhm.
are suppressed anger, especially suppressed disgust. That's where we feel it is in our gut. Um, Insomnia, I personally had insomnia for decades. It's
Mhm.
now completely gone. But I think that was, yeah. And then autoimmune disorders, I really believe, are very severe suppressed anger, chronic.
Mhm.
And I believe our bodies are speaking to us. Actually, I believe when we can get out of our heads and into our bodies and really listen to our bodies and learn to attune to our bodies,
Mhm.
um, those are our inner child speaking to us and saying, "Hey, Bronwyn." For me, my insomnia was little Bronwyn saying, "You need to see our Father for who He really is. You need to really stop dissociating from reality and
Mhm.
being in denial about who He is. You need to see that He's actually just as evil as your mom, and you need to have a boundary with Him." And the minute I started doing that, I started sleeping like a baby for the first time in 30 years. So,
Yeah. And so how does your first degree in nutrition play into your practice? Does that ever is that part of the recommendations that you give your clients as well?
no, that would be again more of a CBT approach because
Okay.
it's treating symptoms. I really see our relationship with our bodies and ourselves. Once we heal that, or even start healing our relationship with ourselves,
Mhm.
we naturally want to self nurture, and that is through a healthy diet. And I think the CBT folks have it all wrong. If you can tell people what to eat, they're not going to last for more than a couple weeks, and
Sure.
until they heal their relationship with their selves,
Mhm.
which is healing their relationship with their anger. Those are one and the same. And so once we start doing that, I have clients come to me out of nowhere. They'll be like, "I started shopping at the farmer's market and I'm like Googling all these recipes and I'm eating so much better." And
Yeah.
they don't even know I have a master's in nutrition. They have no idea that my first career was in nutrition. They're just telling me and they're like, "I started exercising. I just feel so good." And so
Yeah.
I feel like the more we start internally coming to life, the more we just want to be
Mm,
more and more alive. And those outward manifestations just come naturally.
it's fascinating. Very cool. What have I not asked you that you want to make sure you leave with our audience?
Yeah. So I would say to summarize, in a nutshell, our healing our relationship with ourself means being true to ourselves and not betraying ourselves. When we do betray ourselves, we're going to get sick physically or mentally or both. And you know what? Being true to ourselves is not selfish.
Mhm.
It isn't even like, I don't even like the phrase putting ourselves first. I don't like that because that implies other people and other things are second and there's some kind of hierarchy. I, when we're true to ourselves, when we don't betray ourselves, we come more fully alive. That makes us integrate. And what we find is we have so much more to give
Mhm.
others. Most people, not all, because they're not all safe people, but most people just enjoy us more because we're more alive and they trust us more because we're more, what you see is what you get. We're more integrated, we're healthier. So everyone benefits
Mhm.
from us being true to ourselves.
Mhm. Yep, absolutely. Where can people go to learn more about you?
Yeah, so my podcast is Angry at the Right Things. And I think I have 20 episodes now, soon to have 21. And it's just about 20 hours of me and Katie talking about all these things more slowly and then doing the integration exercises.
Awesome. Well, I will link to that in the show notes. And thank you so much, Bronwyn. This has been really fun. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for having me.